Hi, I'm a fossil. Well, compared to most of you young'uns, anyway, my wife Gloria suggested I say I'm a living fossil. She ought to know, I guess. The nice thing about being a living fossil is that I can continue to evolve, unlike a dead fossil. But this California drought, well, I guess it's here too, has affected even us old fossils. To survive as a geezer in California, it's no longer enough to shout, "Get off my lawn!" Nowadays I have to shout, "Get off my brown lawn! Brown is the new green. I mean brown. Heck, I don't care what color it is, just get off it." That's California. Of course, here in Nevada, they don't even know what a lawn is. Get off my dirt. You know, this title bothers me just a little bit. The modern era actually ended about 1970 or so, and all of you are now in the postmodern era. You're soaking in it. You're also postmodern that you don't even realize it anymore. So you see, when I was asked to give this talk, they just gave me this title, but I really want to change it. Unfortunately, it's already the wrong way in your program. I can fix that for you. Everyone just bring up that collision app on your smartphone and look up the title of my talk. Now take out your Sharpie and mark through the word like this. Some of you are so postmodern, you don't even know the jokes. That's okay. Back in the modern area, way back, they used to say, ignorance is no excuse. But nowadays, ignorance is not only a good excuse, it's become absolutely mandatory. Seriously, we've reached the point where there's way too much information for anyone to know all of it. And this is stressing our social institutions. Our institutions were originally built on the theory that a smart person could know just about everything. And nowadays, it takes a team to know everything. Unfortunately, one of the things that teams often don't know is how to work together as a team. The evolution of the Perl development model over time is perhaps instructive here. And maybe that's why you invited me here, or maybe it's just because I'm a fossil. Speaking of living fossils, I wrote a number of programs that helped bootstrap the open source movement, such as RN, Patch, and Metaconfig, but Perl is the one I will likely be remembered for, assuming I'm remembered for anything, which is doubtful. Look up King Ozymandias someday. Perl is older than some of you sitting here, but it's still in heavy use in a number of companies, including Craigslist, where I work. Well, okay, not really. My job title there is artist in residence, which means basically nothing since I'm not in residence. As for the artist part, well, at best I'm a BS artist. Still, they pay me to work on Perl 6. Oh, and they also pay me to mention that they're hiring. So, hi, I'm from Craigslist and we're hiring. People often ask whether I expected Perl to be as popular as it turned out to be. And they're usually a bit surprised when I answer, well, mostly. I already knew that I like certain things and that other people tend to like the things I like. And I'd already released enough other programs to have a pretty good idea that Perl was going to succeed. What I didn't anticipate, though, was the web. Instead, all I did was really make sure Perl was ready for the web. It needed to be good at two things. Perl was a glue language and it was a text processing language. When you think about it, HTML is text processing. And talking to your database backend, well, that needs a glue language that can talk to many APIs. So Perl just happened to be there when the web needed it to get started. Another thing we encouraged was that sense of instant gratification that a scripting language can give you. The sort of, I can do this feeling, even though I don't really know how yet. I'll just hack something together. Not so very long ago, we used to call this agile programming before you guys renamed it to DevOps. Of course, before that, we used to call it rapid prototyping. And before that, well, they called it not using punch cards anymore. So anyway, along comes this thing called the web, and Perl was largely used to bootstrap it. In many people's minds, Perl was just a CGI language, but of course it was never just that. But, you know, public perceptions are difficult to bend, and despite the fact that Perl was a lot more capable than it got credit for, a few other languages came along with their own variety of worse is better approach, and they got some of the market share of web programming too. It's not really the case that the use of Perl is shrinking these days, but rather that the market grew so fast over the years that Perl ended up with a somewhat smaller share of a vastly larger market. Nevertheless, we noticed various things that we could have done better in that initial design of Perl. So way back in the year 2000, we decided it was time to get off that worse is better merry-go-round and to try for a cycle or two of better is better design. So we said to our Perl community, it's time to break backward compatibility just this once. If you could break just one thing that needs breaking, what would it be? So I expected maybe 20 suggestions. We called them RFCs. I expected 20. We got 361. And of course, they were a complete mess. So we just basically threw out most of the suggestions and asked ourselves what the underlying pain points were and redesigned from there. And the rest is history. Lots and lots of history. We've actually kind of got famous now for deciding to take however long it takes to fix everything. Even Duke Nukem Forever beat us out the door. But that's okay. Our slogan now is Second System Syndrome done right. In our case, doing it right turned out to mean take 15 years. If you do the math, that means we're finally releasing Perl 6 this year. And we think Perl 6 is going to be a smashing success because we fixed almost everything that was wrong with Perl 5, and people already loved the programming in that. Plus, we fixed a bunch of things that were wrong in every computer language. But you know, if Perl 6 is a different language from Perl 5, why still call it Perl? Well, because deep down inside, the two languages are still very much like each other. I designed both Perl 5 and Perl 6, and the thing is, my background is more from linguistics than from computer science. So I wanted my computer language to work more like a natural language works, not like how math works. Well, okay, I want the math too. But just for instance, while Perl is pretty easy to learn, that's not what we optimize it for. You spend years learning your natural language, your mother tongue. And you don't mind spending that time because then you're very expressive, you are very fluent. You know, some of you talk about, say, Python as a first language. That's okay, but we don't think of Perl as a first programming language. We think of it more as a last programming language. A lot of the design of Perl is also cultural, not technical. It's not just syntax. But anthropology is really just a word meaning the study of people. That's you guys. And it's the Perl community that makes the language special. You know, it's really funny. The first time they translated the Camel book, that's the book on Perl, they translated the Camel book to Japanese. There's a place where it says the three chief virtues of a programmer are laziness, impatience, and hubris. Well, the Japanese translator felt that he had to insert a parenthetical remark right there that said, this is a joke. But the real community values are in fact the duals of those virtues. Now, the diligence and patience should be obvious from the fact that both Perl 5 and Perl 6 are still well loved and maintained. That humility bit is a little harder to pin down, and it's not just about self-deprecation, though we do have some fun with that. For instance, here's our other name for Perl. But, you know, humility, if it's not about self-deprecation, what is it about? It's really more about seeing yourself accurately, knowing both your strengths and your weaknesses. If you're a theist like me, it's seeing yourself as God sees you. But in any case, it's a matter of seeing straight. Now, I've personally had lots of things go wrong with my eye, my right eye. So this is a metaphor that I feel very deeply. I was blind in my right eye for 14 years. I've had a cornea transplant, 2 cataract surgeries, 2 retinal surgeries, many laser surgeries, far too many to count. My iris on that side is stuck halfway open, so I look even crazier than I am. I have glaucoma in half my macula. Nevertheless, I still have my depth perception, yay. So yeah, I value seeing things accurately, seeing straight, both physically and metaphorically. Earlier this year, I was in Budapest. Here's the palace there. Well, not really, that's a rather distorted image of the palace. The point is that unless you're forced to, we often ignore all those levels of indirection and distortion in what we see, all those levels of interpretation. So I think it's worth working to see past all those distortions. We are creatures who react to many visual ideas, so a lot of the design of Perl 6 is about how to make things look different from each other. I wish I had time to give more examples, but suffice to say that both Lisp and APL violate this principle. They make different things look the same. Perl borrows semantics from both of those languages, but it keeps them distinct visually so you don't get confused. Our visual ideas are not restricted to ASCII or even Indo-European. I've been in love with characters for a couple of decades now, whether you want to call them kanji or hanji or just CJK. Perl has always been a leader when it comes to Unicode processing, and with Perl 6 we're raising the bar yet again. It doesn't matter how many combining characters you put together to form a grapheme. In Perl 6 you can still just consider each grapheme to be one character. Excuse me. You don't have to count how many Unicode code points are in it. You don't have to worry about accidentally splitting a character in the middle. That's all transparent to you. Another thing that is common to Perl culture is the notion of cultural hacks. The original dual licensing model was invented by Perl. That was a cultural hack to let the free software folks and the business folks share the same piece of code without fighting, back when they hated each other, more than they do now. A more recent cultural hack is this notion that Perl 5 and Perl 6 are really sister languages. They're siblings. It stops people from thinking of Perl 6 as the successor language to Perl 5. I contrast that to the Python approach. We are not interested in killing off earlier versions of Perl. So as long as anyone is willing to love and maintain Perl 5, it will still be available. And in fact, Perl 6 has an inline Perl 5 module to support both of them simultaneously, so you can intermix Perl 5 and Perl 6 code. You can migrate piecemeal as you feel you want to. So we allow you to defer migration decisions, which is yet another cultural hack. Another thing about Perl, we don't mind being different. So yeah, we're not much like the other communities you see out there, but that's kind of okay. Our #1 slogan is, there's more than one way to do it. And that applies both outside and inside our community. More than one way includes the Ruby way, and the JavaScript way, or even horrors, the Java way. But it applies inside our community as well. We don't mind diversity. In fact, we celebrate it and encourage it. In biological terms, we think of it as a larger gene pool. And we'll be ready to evolve when an asteroid strikes or a new continent opens up. One of those Perl 6 RFCs asked for a new mascot to replace the camel. So I present to you Camellia, our spokesbug. She's visually distinctive, check. She celebrates diversity, check. And she's not just inclusive of butterflies. She's really designed to be appealing to 7-year-old girls. We need more women in our industry, and we need to interest them at an earlier age and to keep their interest as they mature. So the Perl community is trying to do its part to to capture the imagination of the next generation. But speaking of generations, I noticed that all you millennials out there kind of look like each other. That's okay too. We don't mind being similar to each other. All of the booths have to be the same size, right? But anyway, if you join our community, you have to be different, just like all the rest of us. And one of the ways that we're similar to each other is that we share a bunch of design principles. And in that vein, I'd like to go through some of the shared principles we've used in the design of Perl 6. And many of these principles came from seeing how they were violated in the original 361 RFCs. So I guess they were useful after all. Anything you can do, I can do. Meta. I can do anything meta than you. Yes, you can? No, I can't. Yay, go Annie. The most important meta principle is balance competing principles. You know, nearly all the fights in our community come from trying to balancing conflicting goals. And your community is going to be the same, because it's just human nature to want to take one principle and emphasize it to the exclusion of other principles. It's like, you don't really have a good marriage if you don't fight occasionally, right? That being said, sometimes people ask Gloria and me why we have such a good marriage. One of our answers is, learn to fight fair. Fight about what you're fighting about, not about what you fought about last week. Another strategy that works both for marriages and software communities is going meta, riding above the argument. There are lots of ways to do this, but they basically require you to view your disagreement in the larger context of your friendship. And that's probably a whole talk on its own. But on to more meta principles. Many of these meta principles are about how you balance your other principles. With Perl 6 here, we've already made it work and largely made it work right. So we're pretty much at stage 3, which is why we can promise it's going to come out this year. Yeah, waterbeds are so last century. But, you know, you push a waterbed down here and it goes up over there somewhere else. So, you know, there's conservation of something. You really, really want to balance your principles explicitly, because if you don't, the universe has a way of balancing them out for you instead, and then you will be sad. This has been discovered time and again by startups, who tend to take one brilliant idea and drive it into the ground without considering the unintended consequences. Hey, everyone else is selling stuff on the internet, why not dog food? Well, obviously, because on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Seeing the trade-offs is actually the largest part of my job as a computer language designer. Yeah, that's a nice idea, but you know, if we do that, we're going to lose these 3 other features you want. So we try to keep each other honest that way. When your community has this trusting view of itself, you can be much more efficient. If you have to negotiate every little thing in advance, you spend far too much time painting bike sheds and far too little time riding bicycles. So our development model encourages conjectures and experiments, with occasional backtracking when things don't pan out. Those of you who have looked at Perl 6 know that the scope of the design is, frankly, monumental. And I can safely say we would never have finished it without liberal application of forgiveness. But you know, this one works both ways. It's natural to interpret it as, I get to be magnanimous when somebody else screws up. We all love to be the forgiver. What's hard is to be the forgiven, which leads us to, it's okay to be wrong temporarily. You not only have to be willing to forgive, you have to be willing to be forgiven. It's not really about ego trips, except maybe in some severely damaged people. It's really more just of a cultural thing, an anthropology thing. Anthropologists classify cultures in various ways, but one of the most interesting ways I found is how your culture evaluates vulnerability. Some cultures view vulnerability as a sign of weakness. Other cultures view vulnerability as a sign of strength. And you can see many examples of this in how animals relate to each other. If you're an animal in a pecking order, then displaying a vulnerability can lead other animals to lower your perceived status, maybe even like from predator to prey. On the other hand, there's lots of animals, especially birds for some reason, that display outrageous vulnerabilities. Take, for instance, the huge tail on a peacock. On the surface, it's completely maladaptive. Nevertheless, sexual selection is a powerful force, and those birds with the bigger tails get more mates because they've proven to be so fit that they can afford to flaunt their vulnerabilities. The same thing happens in human culture. If I show you all my weaknesses, but convey a sense that I don't mind you knowing all my weaknesses, then you might perceive this as a sign of strength rather than of weakness. So, for instance, if you want to be a BDFL, a benevolent dictator for life, like me, then people have to let you act like a dictator sometimes. So we have the usual rule, of course, Larry is always right. That's good dictator rule. But sometimes the BDFL screws up and needs some of that forgiveness we mentioned earlier. Look into my eyes. You will perceive this as a sign of strength. It's a kind of seeing straight applied to the leader as well as to the followers. And it's a kind of humility. It reminds me that the only reason I still get to lead is that I do not abuse my dictatorial powers too often. And it sets a good example for the community. If you want gentle people in the community, you should be gentle yourself. Good leaders are decisive, right? Well, maybe. Let me think about that a little bit more. In particular, when you know you don't know enough about something, you shouldn't decide things you're not sure about yet. Duh. There are plenty of other things to decide first. So in our case, for a long time we delayed defining any concurrency primitives for Perl 6. We just didn't feel we had the right model yet. They all sucked. But eventually languages like Go and C# developed some very nicely scalable and composable concurrency models, particularly in regards to reactive programming. And now Perl 6 has stolen some of those best ideas, all because we waited. And you don't have to do nothing while you're waiting for that idea to come along. Your goal here is to simply avoid falling into a can't get there from here situation. Perl 6 currently takes this approach to the logic programming paradigm. We're probably not going to be supporting that this year, but we think we understand most of the corner cases. So this year we're busily not painting ourselves into those corners. We think a lot about how your brain produces and consumes language, and about how you deal with ambiguity. That UPC barcode you see on your cereal boxes, that's a self-clocking code. Each pair of bars and spaces adds up to a width of 7. It's a self-clocking code. In human languages, written Japanese doesn't need spaces between words because each word tends to begin with a kanji and end with a hiragana. Similarly, classical Greeks could leave out word spaces because there are only certain ways a Greek word can end. Perl is also self-clocking with a strong rhythm that goes back and forth between expecting a term versus expecting an operator. And this allows Perl to give much better error messages in many cases. Contrast this with most other languages that don't do much better than something's wrong near line 73. You figure it out. In Perl 5, you have to remember which names are global, and you have to remember which functions default to the current topic. We fixed that in 6. You know all those old murder mystery movies where someone calls you up and says, I know who the murderer is, and then the phone goes dead. Oops. No, if you're in that kind of a movie, you should say the name of the murderer first, and only then add the supporting detail. Similarly, design your computer language so that the reader doesn't have to search for the important bits buried way down in the code somewhere. Put them out front. I think you know what this means. We were all told a place for everything and everything in its place. And in my estimation, most languages don't provide enough places to put things. Some things are naturally global. Most things want to be lexically scoped or possibly dynamically scoped. a good many pieces of data should simply be associated with the appropriate object, and then that object should be hung on the right peg. It's like pockets in your coat. You know, Perl violated this principle in many ways, which is why Perl 6 doesn't. Many languages, including Perl 5, distinguish big integers from normal integers. Unlike Perl 5, Perl 6 does not distinguish them because that's an artificial discontinuity. By default, in Perl 6, math just works. Most ambiguity in computer languages is caused by parsing a bit of text as two different languages. In fact, when you think about it, that's the underlying mechanism of all injection attacks. So when we have to parse a sublanguage now in Perl 6, we never reparse. We just drop into a lower level grammar that then returns to the upper level grammar when it's done. More generally, it's okay to write generic code, but only if you do it on purpose, only if you know you're writing generic code. For instance, we've never allowed RC files with Perl, the startup files, and we never are going to, because then the programmers really have no idea what language they're programming in, even right there at the start of their program. We allow you to mutate the language, but only by explicit declaration in your program. Mathematics has demonstrated that having lots of different operators actually aids understanding for a number of reasons. You can make systems of operators that look quite different from other sorts of operators, and it's immediately obvious to the reader when there's this new operator that needs to be learned. It's usually difficult to mistake operators for data in math, and so too in Perl, unlike in a language such as Lisp, where the two are intentionally confused. And further than that, now that we're in the age of Unicode, we have plenty of characters to pick from, and there's really no reason to overload existing operators with completely unrelated meanings. In Perl, plus always means mathematical addition, and it never means concatenation. That's a different operator. Even worse, we'll never ever overload the bit shift operator to do I/O, unlike, say, C++. Concision, that means conciseness. Generally, picking the right default is easy once you think about it, since you just have to pick the default that creates a shorter, more understandable code. The trick is to actually think about it, and not just assume that the current default is the right default. Don't settle for the default, as it were. Perl 5 was rather notorious as a good golfing language, but we've intentionally detuned Perl 6 as a golf language. Efficiency and elegance should be measured in ideas, not in keystrokes. In those 361 RFCs for Perl 6, maybe 100 of them proposed a new meaning for the colon character. Perl 6 has maybe 5 or 6 different meanings for colon these days, and to my knowledge, none of them actually came from the RFCs. This is actually just one manifestation of the fact there's just not enough ASCII on your keyboard. So use your punctuation wisely. In particular, there aren't enough brackets in ASCII. The first place that Perl 6 broke out of ASCII into Latin 1 was to use those fancy French angle brackets up in the Latin 1 area. No, you don't have to use them if you don't want to. We have other versions of them. Yes, they're easy to type in if you do want them. No, you don't need a special key on your keyboard for every character you use. That's why we have various input methods. People from other languages understand this much better than English speakers do for various imperialistic reasons. There's this thing we call Huffman coding. Originally, it was just a compression algorithm that uses a few bits for the common characters and longer sequences of bits for uncommon characters. But in our culture, we've taken the term to be a more metaphorical meaning. For instance, we have the slogan, there's more than one way to do it, but we really only apply that to the common operations. For uncommon operations, one way to do it is usually enough. Here's another example. When we come up with keywords, we take the frequency of use into account. When we declare variables, we have a thing called a declarator. So the shortest declarator in Perl is my, M-Y. Only 2 letters, because that's by far the most common use. When we declare attributes of an object, it's slightly less common, so we use 3-letter, has, to indicate the has a relationship. State variables use 5 letters because they're even less common, and so on. Huffman coding occurs in other spaces than just bit or byte counts. In particular, mental distance is important. So if we want to allow a feature but discourage its use, we make it big and ugly and difficult to type. Perl 6 allows symbolic references, for instance, but the syntax is always harder than the corresponding hard reference syntax because people get into trouble with symbolic references, excuse me. So we just try to discourage them. Similarly, Ruby programmers love monkey patching, but we discourage it by requiring an ugly pre-declaration. You have to say, use monkey typing, all caps at the top of your program. It's also a pun on the millions of monkeys trying to type Shakespeare. In either case, the result tends to be gibberish. Python, I'm looking at you here, and a lot of other languages. It's not like basic mathematical concepts are going to change tomorrow. Just because the hipsters love the flavor of the month language in terms of computers, it doesn't mean that mathematicians are going to abandon trigonometry tomorrow. You may have noticed that most mathematicians are not hipsters. They prefer to prove things that stay put once they're proved. Anyway, in Perl 6, math simply works. Speaking of simplicity, we all love simplicity, so why the heck do we have so many ways to say it? I think I like that last one the best. There are many mental traps people fall into, such as don't do the first thing that occurs to you. That would be like PHP. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a thumbnail, like those parentheses in Lisp. Vice scripts, they're the wrong tool for any job, but they'll do any job. Shell programming comes to mind here. Escape hatches are for emergency. Yeah, Perl has eval, it has begin blocks. Yeah, in fact, it has a complete meta model, and you can use that to cheat on encapsulation if you like. Those things are there to make hard things possible. Your problem is not that hard. Wait until you're desperate. Most computer languages have some degree of dwim, that is, do what I mean. We have a principle that says for every dwim, there's a corresponding wat. I think that's a cross between what and wah, like a duck. That is, every place you try to teach the computer to outsmart the user, there's another place where you've just taught the computer to outstupid the user instead. The trick, of course, in computer language design is to hide the wats in the corners where the people rarely trip over them and leave those dwims out in plain view. One place where dwimery tends to mess up other computer languages is in auto-declaration. Both Python and Ruby have some fancy rules for when they'll auto-declare a variable for you the first time you assign to it, and these rules trip people up continually, so we don't do that in Perl 6. Instead, we just make it really easy to declare your variables explicitly. Then the scope of your variables is always very clear, regardless of where the first assignment is. Now, we don't get to name fundamental particles like the physicists do, but often we have fun naming constructs in our language. After the Python community outlawed the phrase lol in their channels, we made sure to install a lol function into Perl 6, where LOL stands for list of lists. Sometimes this sort of thing gets out of hand, though, so we have this phrase, you think that's cute today. Then we all laugh and we reevaluate and see if there really is a better name for it. But we're not really biased against a cute name if it works for other reasons. So for instance, we have a rat type, short for rational numbers. That is, a fraction. sometimes you want to extract the numerator and sometimes the denominator, and sometimes you want to extract both of them. So the numerator is nu and the denominator is de. So the method to extract both of them is .nude. So we've got nude rats in Perl 6. For some reason, nobody has any trouble remembering that method name. Finally, a number of our principles have nothing to do with the technology, but just remind us how our community works. One of them I call the Volleyball Principle. That principle simply states it's better to have too many people going for the ball than too few. There's nothing more embarrassing to a pair of volleyball players than for both of them to stand there flat-footed while the ball whizzes between them, because each of them assumed the other person was going to go for it. Good volleyball players would rather risk crashing their heads together by both going for the ball. Likewise, in a software project, accidentally duplicating someone else's work is not something to be considered shameful. And it's okay to say something that someone else has already said, or to ask the same question someone else just asked. That being said, our implementers actually love this particular one because they like people to see how much torment they're in. So it's actually one of our most motivational community principles. And we understand that not all the work is fun all the time. That being said, we also optimize for fun whenever we can. And some people seem to think that professionals can't have fun, and that any spark of joy indicates insincerity of purpose. Nothing could be further from the truth. We do Perl 6 because it's fun on a deep level. Perhaps we should really call it joy, because you can have that sort of joy even when you are suffering vicariously on behalf of others. It's our joy to optimize for your eventual fun as users. So what's the take home? Some of you are the users that we've been tormenting ourselves on behalf of for the last 15 years. Some of you sitting here today are going to have an enormous amount of fun getting useful stuff done with Perl 6. If you'd like to play with it before its official release this Christmas, feel free to visit perl6.org or to visit on the Perl 6 IRC channel on Freenode. And we'll try to make you feel at home. Thanks for listening.
Does anybody have any questions for Larry? Got time for a couple questions? You might be in luck, Larry. I think you might not have questions. Oh, there we go. Why am I standing behind this table? Oh, she'd like to have your autograph if that's possible.
Oh, yeah. I'll stick around if you want me to sign something.
Awesome. I have a little bit of a question. I developed in Perl for a while. I do Ruby now. Is Perl working towards anything as far as like the Internet of Things or drone interaction or anything like that, similar to other languages like Ruby, PHP, and a lot of the JavaScript languages?
To the extent that the entire object-oriented paradigm is geared toward dealing with things and models of things, we're very strong on object orientation among other things these days. It's a much cleaner model. The problem with Perl 5 is we almost made too many ways to do it, and we sort of made an object-oriented workbench, and you could sort of roll your own. That thing about picking the right default, one of the places where we picked much better defaults is in the object-oriented space, where there's one obvious way to do it most of the time. You still can get underneath and be as flexible as you like, but we try to make one way the obvious way, and that'll feed right into the Internet of Things, I think.
Very cool, very cool. Any other, okay?
I apologize because I'm kind of a beginner with Perl, but in the challenge of going from 5 to 6, there's so much documentation and community out there on Perl 5, probably because that's really when I feel like the web kind of grew up and documentation and forums were really working. Do you have any thoughts on how that's going to change? Will you put Perl 6 modules into the same sort of repositories and forums?
We've done lots and lots, I'd say we, my community, the Perl 6 developers have done lots and lots of work on the documentation end of things. The annotations for pod are actually much more powerful now, and they're tied with the things that instead of just being arbitrarily in the same file, they're actually tied with the constructs that are declared close to them. So we can now produce autodocs that straight from the definitions of functions, and annotate those and produce decent documentation that way. You know, we have people whose pretty much full-time job is, well, full-time hobby is developing the documentation these days. So yeah, we pay a lot of attention to that. As for migrating, you know, there are documents that say here are the things that correspond between Perl 5 and Perl 6. And the other thing to say about that is, you know, both Perl 5 and Perl 6 were designed as languages that you didn't have to learn the whole language to use it usefully in the first place. You know, these languages that are a little too orthogonal, you have to learn everything before. We like to think there's a small end of the language that you can use as you're growing into the language, and then you learn things as you need to learn them. We already saw this happening in Perl 5. When Perl 5 came out, we put in real closures. But we didn't actually call them that. We said, well, we got anonymous subroutines. You can take references to them. Then at some point, somebody writes a callback that references lexical variables outside of itself, and they just work right. And at that point, when they see that, then they are ready to understand what closures are. So we try to make the language such that it stays out of your way until you need to know the next thing. Is also part of the thing.
Okay, last question right here, Larry.
Hi, I was curious, all kind of in the same vein, but how do you divide up your time between traveling to conferences, writing documentation, responding to mailing lists versus writing code? And all in the vein of, why did it take 15 years? Were you the bottleneck, or was it simply that much work that had to be done? And are there any particular lessons you would share with somebody embarking on a similarly ambitious project like overhauling the tax code?
Yeah, how I divide my time, the answer is poorly. Ask my wife. Yeah, I just play it by ear. Advice for people who are trying to bite off such a large project as we bit off, especially if you open source. You know the saying, good, fast, cheap, pick two? If you're working in open source and not at a startup, it has to be cheap. So it reduces down to good or fast. Pick one. And so you can get something out fast, it won't be good. You can get something out good, and it won't be fast. So you kind of have to plan in advance. It's just going to take however long it takes. We, you know, when we started off, we had a lot of ideas, and we knew, as I said, our slogan was second system syndrome done right. We knew we were biting off something that was impossible. We knew we were going to fail, but we knew we were going to end up with a very interesting failure. And that's what we have now, is a very interesting failure. Because there's no way we could have done everything that we planned to do. But as we worked through trying to do some of those things, we saw many underlying unifications and simplifications and ways of doing things better over time. So it was you know, it was a vast research project, really. And we knew what the end goal looked like. And so we had to kind of take a flooding algorithm, you know, the way science, you know, does all these different experiments, and some of them succeed, some of them fail. We knew we had to do this sort of flooding algorithm too. But because we were just going to take however long it needed to take, I'm going to stay behind the speakers here. We intentionally, as we did these various flooding algorithms, we just sort of kept continuous pressure saying, it does not have to converge fast, but it must converge. So, you know, the last 5-10 years, We've kept this gentle pressure on saying, how are we diverging or are we converging? And if we're converging, we'll get there someday. And we're trying to build a 100-year language here, as Paul Graham, said in one of his essays. So if it takes 10 years or 15, that's sort of a short time in the overall scheme of things. Tolkien took 15 years to write The Lord of the Rings. He did pretty well with that. And I think we'll do pretty well with Perl 6.
All right, Larry, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much. Got to wrap it up. We're honored to have you here on the Builders stage.